Welcome to Creepy Whispers. I'm Jack Thompson, and here we'll explore stories that will send chills down your spine. Get ready to dive into the unknown, where each whisper hides a secret. I was never one to believe in ghost stories or supernatural things, But after what happened to me in that abandoned train tunnel in Pennsylvania, man, I don't know what to believe anymore. It all started when some friends of mine invited me to do some urban exploration one weekend. We always enjoyed visiting abandoned places, taking cool photos, feeling that adrenaline rush. But this time was different. One of the guys in the group, Jake, had heard about an old tunnel on the outskirts of Pittsburgh that was supposedly haunted, according to the stories. At first, I laughed at the idea. Ghosts? Come on. But I admit I was curious. Jake told us that the tunnel had been closed for over 50 years after a horrible accident with a train full of passengers. He said that people in the area swore they heard strange noises coming from there, like train whistles and screams. Some even talked about seeing shadows entering and leaving the tunnel. I thought it was just made up stuff, those legends people invent to scare tourists. But I agreed to go anyway. We arranged to meet on a Saturday afternoon, bringing flashlights, food, and even sleeping bags. Yeah, the idea was to spend the night there. Little did I know that this decision would change my life forever. On the day, we met at a gas station near the edge of town. There were 5 of us: me, Jake, Sarah, Mike, and Olivia. We filled up Mike's old SUV, which he swore was perfect for this kind of adventure, and set off. The trip to the tunnel took about 2 hours, mostly on pothole-filled back roads. The whole time I kept thinking if it wouldn't have been better to stay home playing video games. But then we arrived at the location and man, the atmosphere changed completely. The tunnel was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by a dense forest that seemed to swallow everything around it. The entrance was a dark and imposing mouth, half hidden by bushes and vines. You could see the rusty tracks disappearing into the darkness. I confess, I felt a shiver down my spine as soon as I laid eyes on it. It was as if the place had a life of its own, As if it was watching us, waiting for us to enter. Jake, all excited, started telling more details about the accident. He said it was in 1962, a night train going from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia. Apparently, there was a derailment inside the tunnel, and the train caught fire. Many people couldn't escape. As he spoke, I swore I could smell smoke in the air, even though I knew it was impossible after so much time. We stood there at the entrance for a while, kind of hesitant. Mike took some photos and Sarah started live streaming on Instagram, all excited. Olivia seemed as nervous as I was, but nobody wanted to be the first to admit they were scared. When the sun started to set, Jake suggested we go in to set up camp. We grabbed our backpacks, turned on our flashlights, and took our first steps into the tunnel. The sound of our footsteps echoed in a strange way, as if the place was much bigger than it seemed. The light from our flashlights could barely penetrate the darkness ahead. We walked about 100 meters in when we decided to stop and set up camp. The idea was to stay close enough to the entrance for a quick exit if needed, but far enough to feel the vibe of the place, as Jake put it. As we were setting things up, I started noticing some strange things. First, it was the cold. It was scorching hot outside, but inside the tunnel, the temperature dropped so much we could see our breath. Then there were the sounds. Every now and then, I swore I could hear metallic creaks, as if something heavy was moving on the tracks. Mike said it was just the wind, but there was no wind in there. And then there was that time when we all clearly heard the sound of running footsteps, coming from deeper in the tunnel. Sarah shone her most powerful flashlight in the direction of the noise, but we saw nothing but darkness. As the night wore on, the atmosphere became increasingly heavy. We tried to keep the mood light, telling stories and eating the snacks we brought, but it was as if the tunnel was slowly swallowing us. Around midnight, the first thing that really scared me happened. I was sitting near the tunnel wall, half dozing, when I felt something ice cold touch my shoulder. I jumped up startled and lit up the spot with my flashlight, but there was nothing there. When I turned back to the group, I noticed they were all staring fixedly at a point behind me, their eyes wide with fear. Slowly, I turned again, and that's when I saw it. There was a hazy figure standing about 5 meters away. It looked like a man wearing an old train conductor's uniform, but it was semi-transparent and floating a few centimeters above the ground. His face, man, I'll never forget that expression of pure terror frozen on his features. I was paralyzed, unable to move or speak. The apparition stayed there for a few seconds that felt like an eternity, then simply vanished into thin air. When I finally managed to move, I realized I was shaking from head to toe. I looked at my friends and saw they were as terrified as I was. Olivia started crying softly, while Jake, who had been so brave before, now looked as white as a sheet. After that, nobody could stay still anymore. We stood in a circle, with our flashlights pointed in all directions. Mike suggested we leave, but Jake insisted we should stay. He said this was exactly what we had come for. I was torn between the fear of staying and the curiosity of what else might happen. That's when we heard it. A train whistle, distant at first, but getting louder and louder. The sound was coming from inside the tunnel, from the darkest part we hadn't explored. The noise kept getting louder, along with a tremor that made the tracks vibrate. It was as if a train was coming towards us, but that was impossible, right? The tunnel had been abandoned for decades. Still, the sound got so loud we had to cover our ears. Sarah screamed that she could see a light approaching. I looked in the direction she was pointing and froze. There it was, a bright light cutting through the darkness, getting bigger every second. The noise was deafening now, mixed with what sounded like screams of panicked people. Someone yelled for us to run, and that's what we did. We ran towards the tunnel exit as if our lives depended on it, stumbling on the tracks and each other. The race to the tunnel exit was a nightmare. The light behind us was getting more and more intense. The sound of the train and the screams were deafening. I could feel the ground shaking under my feet, as if there really was a giant train chasing us. At some point, I tripped and fell. When I turned to look back, I saw something I'll never forget. It was an old train, on fire, advancing towards us. But it wasn't solid. It was like a ghostly, transparent image. I could see faces pressed against the windows, expressions of pure terror. It was as if, for an instant, I was seeing the accident happen right in front of me. Someone pulled me by the arm. I think it was Mike, and we kept running. When we finally got out of the tunnel, we threw ourselves on the ground, panting and shaking. The noise and light had completely disappeared, as if they had never existed. We lay there for a while, unable to speak or move. The sky was starting to lighten, the first rays of sun appearing through the trees. Slowly, we got up and looked at each other. No one needed to say anything. It was clear in everyone's eyes that we had experienced something inexplicable and terrifying. We returned to the car in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. No one mentioned the subject during the trip back. It was as if we had made a silent pact not to talk about what happened, at least not at that moment. It wasn't until we got back to the city, late in the morning, that Jake finally broke the silence. He asked if we were sure about what we saw. No one answered immediately, but gradually we started sharing our experiences. Each of us had seen or felt something a little different, but everyone agreed on one thing. What happened that night was real and inexplicable. It's been a few months since that night in the tunnel, and to this day, I can't explain what happened. I tried to research more about the history of the accident, but I didn't find much beyond what we already knew. Sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear the train whistle and see those ghostly figures. I never went back to that place, and I don't intend to. But one thing is certain, that experience completely changed my view of the world. Now I know that there are things that science still can't explain, things that defy our understanding of reality. And honestly, I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully understand what happened that night in the abandoned tunnel in Pennsylvania. I don't even know where to start telling this. A few months ago, my family and I moved to a small town in the countryside, We were looking for a quieter place to raise the kids, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. We found a perfect house, good price, spacious, with a huge backyard for the boys to play in. The only but was that it was kind of close to an abandoned railway line, but honestly, at the time, we didn't even care about that. Think of a beautiful house, all renovated, big windows, view of the woods. It seemed like a dream ... in the first few weeks. Everything was fine. We were really enjoying the peace and quiet, the fresh air, the stars you could see at night. But then, I don't know, about 3 weeks after we had moved in, I started noticing some strange things. At first, it was just little noises at night, nothing major. Like, I'd wake up in the middle of the night thinking I'd heard something, but when I paid attention, it was nothing. You know when you're alone at home and you swear you heard a noise, but then you think, it must be all in my head. It was kind of like that, but it started getting more frequent, and I started to get a bit paranoid. One night, around AM, I woke up to a noise that sounded like a train whistle. I froze, man. Like, I knew that line had been deactivated for years. I got up from the bed slowly, so as not to wake my wife, and went to the bedroom window. I pulled back the curtain and looked outside. The moon was full, illuminating the tracks that passed about 100 meters from our house. And that's when I saw it. I swear to God, I'm not making this up. There was a figure walking on the tracks. It was the silhouette of a man, slightly hunched, walking very slowly. I stood paralyzed, not knowing what to do. My heart was racing. I thought about calling my wife, but I couldn't move. I stood there, glued to the window, watching that shadowy figure move. Suddenly, the figure stopped and turned its head towards my house. Man, I felt a chill down my spine that I can't even explain. It was as if he was staring at me, even from far away. I closed the curtain on impulse and went back to bed. I stayed awake all night, in a cold sweat. The next day, I tried to convince myself that it had just been a nightmare, But deep down, I knew it had really happened. In the days that followed, I became a bit paranoid. I didn't tell my wife about what I had seen. I didn't want to scare her for no reason, but I started to pay more attention to everything. During the day, I would go to work normally at the office in town, but as soon as I got home, I'd keep an eye out for any suspicious movement outside. The kids kept playing in the backyard as if nothing had happened, and I tried to act normally. But every time I looked at the tracks, I felt a shiver. A week after that night, I was in the living room watching TV after everyone had gone to bed. It was around midnight when I heard it again. The train whistle. But this time, it wasn't distant like before. It seemed to be coming from right behind our house. I jumped up and ran to the window. What I saw left me breathless. There was a train stopped on the tracks. But it wasn't a normal train, man. It was like it was. Transparent. You could see through it as if it was made of smoke. And there at the front of the locomotive was a man. The same figure I had seen before, but now I could see more details. He was wearing an old conductor's uniform, and was looking directly at my house. I stood there, unable to move, looking at that surreal scene. The conductor started walking towards my house, and I swear I felt the ground tremble under my feet. It wasn't a strong vibration, but you could feel it, as if a real train was passing by. My first instinct was to run and wake everyone up, but something held me there. It was as if I was hypnotized. As he approached, I started to feel an intense cold, as if the temperature had dropped about 20 degrees suddenly. When he got close to the window, I could see his face. Man, it was the saddest face I've ever seen in my life. His eyes were opaque without shine, but full of a pain that I can't even describe. He raised his hand as if he was going to touch the glass, and I involuntarily took a step back. It was at that moment that I heard a scream coming from the children's room. The noise broke the trance I was in. I blinked hard, and when I looked back at the window, the conductor had disappeared. The ghost train was no longer there either. I ran to my children's room, my heart in my mouth. I entered the children's room out of breath. My youngest son, 6 years old, was sitting on the bed, crying. My wife was already there, trying to calm him down. He said he had seen a man at the window, a man who glowed. My wife looked at me confused, asking if I had heard anything. I was shaking, man. I didn't know what to say. How was I going to explain what had just happened? I ended up saying that I had heard a strange noise and came to check. I spent the whole night awake, sitting in the armchair in the children's room, looking at the window. The next day, I decided to investigate. I took advantage of it being Saturday and went to the town library. The lady who worked there, a nice old lady named Mrs. Thompson, looked at me curiously when I asked for information about the history of the railway line. She hesitated for a moment, as if deciding whether or not to tell me something. After a few seconds, she sighed and started talking. About 50 years ago, there was a terrible accident on that line. A conductor named William Harper was operating the last train of the night when the brakes failed. The train derailed on a curve, killing dozens of passengers and William himself, Mrs. Thompson continued telling me that, after the accident, many people swore they saw William Harper's ghost walking on the tracks at night. They said he carried a lantern and seemed to be looking for something. The line was closed shortly after, not just because of the accident, but because no one wanted to work there anymore. As she spoke, I felt my stomach sink. Everything made sense now. The train whistle, the figure on the tracks, the apparition at my window. But why had he come to my house? I went home with my mind racing. I didn't tell my wife anything yet, but I started researching more about the accident on the internet. I discovered that William Harper was known for being extremely dedicated to his work. He never married, never had children. The train was his life. Some old articles mentioned that, before the accident, William had requested maintenance on the brakes, but the railway company ignored it. He knew something was wrong, but he was forced to make that last trip. Man, can you imagine the weight this guy carried? The guilt, the regret. I started to understand why his spirit still wandered there. In the days that followed, I became obsessed with William Harper's story. I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the accident, about everything that had happened. At night, I would stay awake, waiting to hear the train whistle or see the figure on the tracks. My wife started to notice that something was wrong. I was quieter, distracted. The dark circles under my eyes betrayed my sleepless nights. She would ask me what was going on, but I always changed the subject. How was I going to explain to her that we were living near a haunted railway line? One night, about 2 weeks after my encounter with William's ghost, I woke up suddenly. It wasn't because of any noise. It was a strange silence that woke me up. You know when it's so quiet, it's uncomfortable? I looked at the clock. 3:33 a.m. I got up from the bed slowly and went to the window. The moonlight illuminated the tracks like the other time, but there was no sign of the ghost conductor. Even so, I felt that something was wrong. That's when I noticed the back door, which led to the backyard, was ajar. I'm absolutely sure I had locked it before going to sleep. My heart raced. I stood paralyzed for a few seconds, not knowing what to do. I thought about waking my wife, but something told me I needed to deal with this alone. I grabbed a baseball bat I kept in the closet and went down the stairs as quietly as possible. Each step I took seemed to make a deafening noise in the silence of the early morning. I reached the kitchen and saw that the back door was still ajar. A cold breeze was coming through it, making the curtains move slightly. I took a deep breath and approached the door. With a trembling hand, I opened it completely. The backyard was bathed in moonlight, creating strange shadows everywhere. That's when I saw it. Footprints in the grass. They weren't normal footprints, man. They glowed slightly, as if they were made of silver dust. And they were heading towards the children's room. I felt my blood run cold. Without thinking twice, I dropped the bat and ran back into the house. Climbing the stairs 2 at a time, I arrived breathless at the upstairs hallway. The door to my children's room was ajar, and a weak, flickering light was coming from inside. My heart felt like it was going to explode in my chest. I pushed the door open slowly, and what I saw left me breathless. There he was, William Harper, the ghost conductor, standing next to my youngest son's bed. But it wasn't scary as I expected. He emitted a soft light, almost comforting. My son was sitting on the bed, looking at him with a mixture of curiosity and calmness. William turned to me when I entered. His eyes were no longer opaque and sad like before. There was a peace in them that I can't explain. He smiled slightly and said, in a voice that seemed to come from far away, I just wanted to have had the chance to protect someone, to do the right thing. Then he leaned over my son and whispered something in his ear. My boy nodded as if he understood perfectly. At that moment, William began to disappear, dissolving into the air like mist. Before completely vanishing, he looked at me one last time and said, "Take good care of them. That's what really matters." I stood there, unable to move, trying to process what had just happened. My son looked at me and smiled, as if all of this was the most normal thing in the world. "Daddy," he said, "the train man said everything's okay now. He won't be sad anymore." I approached the bed and hugged my son tightly, tears streaming down my face uncontrollably. At that moment, my wife entered the room, startled by the noise. She saw us hugging and asked what had happened. I could only say that everything was okay now. In the days that followed, I tried to understand what had really happened that night. Why had William Harper chosen our family? Why had he appeared in my son's room? Gradually, I started to put the pieces together. William never had the chance to have a family, to protect someone. Maybe somehow, he saw in us the opportunity to do what he couldn't in life. He wasn't an evil presence, as I had imagined at first. He was just a lost soul seeking redemption. Since that night, things have changed around here. I haven't heard the train whistle again, nor seen the figure on the tracks. It's as if William had finally found the peace he was looking for. But something remained from this experience. Every time I look out the window and see those abandoned tracks, I feel a mixture of chills and gratitude. Chills for what we lived through, and gratitude for the lesson I learned. Life is too short to let the important things pass us by. Now I hug my children tighter, say "I love you" to my wife more often. William Harper taught me, in the most unusual way possible, the value of what really matters. Sometimes, I still wake up in the middle of the night and go to the window. I no longer look for ghosts or spectral trains. I just look at my family sleeping, and I'm thankful. Thankful for every moment, every hug, every laugh. And who knows, maybe somewhere, William Harper is finally at peace, knowing that his last journey wasn't in vain. I still get chills when I think about that night in the mountains. I was just a curious journalist thirsty for a good story when I heard rumors about the ghost train. A passenger train that had disappeared decades ago during an intense blizzard and supposedly reappeared every winter, with its passengers staring blankly out the windows. At first, I thought it was just another local legend, you know. But the more I investigated, the more intrigued I became. The stories were too consistent, too detailed to be just a figment of imagination. That's when I decided I needed to see for myself, not knowing that this decision would put me face to face with something I could never explain. I arrived in the small mountain town on a cold winter afternoon. The sky was heavy, and the residents on the streets were hurrying, as if they knew something bad was about to happen. As I walked to the inn where I would be staying, I noticed the suspicious glances they were giving me. It was as if they knew exactly why I was there and didn't like it one bit. At the reception, an elderly lady handed me the room keys with trembling hands. "Be careful, young man," she whispered. "Some stories are better when they remain buried in the snow." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I ignored them, thinking it was just another local superstition. I spent the rest of that day talking to the locals, trying to gather more information about the ghost train. Most people averted their eyes and quickly changed the subject when I mentioned the case. But in a local bar, I found an elderly gentleman who seemed willing to talk. My father was the engineer of that train, he said, his voice choked up. He never came home that night. No one did. He told me about the terrible blizzard that hit the region, about how the train simply disappeared without a trace. And now, every winter, people swear they see it pass. But that's not all, he continued, leaning in closer. They say that those who look directly at the passengers in the windows, well, they're never the same again. I left the bar with my head spinning, a mix of journalistic excitement and an irrational fear that I couldn't explain. I decided that the next morning, I would climb the mountain to investigate the place where the train supposedly disappeared. I returned to the inn and tried to sleep, but I kept tossing and turning in bed, my mind filled with images of ghostly trains and passengers with empty stares. Outside, the wind howled, and I could hear the sinister clanking of what sounded like metal against metal. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind in the trees, but a part of me knew there was something more, something I wasn't prepared to face. I woke up before dawn, my heart racing and a sense of urgency I couldn't explain. I looked out the window and saw that a blizzard had started during the night. Large snowflakes fell from the dark sky, covering everything with a silent white blanket. For a moment, I hesitated. Would it be wise to climb the mountain in this weather? But something inside me compelled me to go on. I put on my warmest clothes, grabbed my backpack with equipment, and headed out into the deserted street. The path to the mountain was steep and treacherous, especially with the accumulated snow. As I climbed, the blizzard worsened, making it difficult to see more than a few meters ahead. The cutting wind seemed to whisper warnings, telling me to turn back. But I continued, driven by a determination I didn't fully understand. After what seemed like hours of exhausting walking, I reached a clearing. That's when I heard something that made my blood run cold, the distant but unmistakable whistle of a train. Impossible, I thought. There hadn't been active tracks in this part of the mountain for decades. Yet the sound echoed through the blizzard, getting closer and closer. I stood paralyzed, my body shaking not just from the cold, but from a primal fear that was taking over me. The whistle sounded again, closer this time, a accompanied by a metallic noise that seemed to come from all directions. The blizzard intensified, turning the world around me into a white whirlwind. That's when I saw it. Through the curtain of snow, the silhouette of an old train appeared, moving slowly, as if sliding on invisible tracks. I rubbed my eyes, certain I was hallucinating due to the cold and fatigue, but the vision persisted. The train was exactly as the locals had described, an old model with dark wooden carriages and rusty metal details. The foggy windows glowed with a faint, ghostly light. As it passed by me, I felt a cold that went beyond the physical, as if all life and warmth were being sucked out of the air. Against my better judgment, I approached. That's when I saw the faces. Pressed against the foggy windows were dozens of pale faces, with glazed eyes and expressions of pure terror frozen on their features. I tried to scream, but no sound came out of my throat. The train continued its slow and inexorable path, gradually disappearing into the blizzard, leaving only the distant echo of its whistle and the metallic sound of non-existent wheels. I stood there, motionless, for a time I can't determine. My mind struggled to process what I had just witnessed. When I finally regained control of my body, I realized I was shaking violently, and it wasn't just from the cold. I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it was a hallucination caused by the altitude and stress. But deep down, I knew it was real as the snow under my feet and the cutting wind on my face. I decided to follow the direction in which the train had disappeared, driven by a mixture of fear and journalistic curiosity that seemed to have a life of its own. I walked for what seemed like hours, fighting against the worsening blizzard. Visibility was almost zero, and I began to fear I had completely lost my way. That's when I stumbled on something buried in the snow. I dug with trembling, frozen hands, and my heart almost stopped when I realized what it was. A piece of train track, rusted and twisted, as if it had been torn from the ground by an unimaginable force. Next to it, I found something that made my stomach churn. An old pocket watch, stopped exactly at the time the train had disappeared decades ago, according to the reports I had heard. At that moment, any doubts I might still have had dissipated. The ghost train was real, and I was at the epicenter of a mystery that defied all logic. With my heart pounding, I pocketed the watch and continued my journey, now with a renewed purpose. The blizzard seemed to have taken on a life of its own, howling around me as if it wanted to prevent me from discovering more. Each step was a struggle against the wind and the rapidly accumulating snow. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet changed. It was no longer soft snow, but something solid and metallic. I cleared the snow with my hands and discovered I was standing on top of a train car, partially buried in the mountainside. With a mix of horror and fascination, I began to explore the remains of the train. The metal was twisted and rusted, as if it had been the victim of a terrible accident. I found an opening and, against all good sense, decided to enter. The interior was surprisingly preserved, as if time had stopped on that fateful day. Dust-covered seats, old suitcases in the luggage racks, and a sepulchral silence that seemed to swallow even the sound of the storm outside. As I advanced down the narrow corridor, a feeling of being watched grew in me. I turned abruptly, and for an instant, I swore I saw a figure sitting on one of the seats, staring at me with empty eyes. But when I blinked, it had disappeared. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it echoing through the empty carriage. Each step I took made the rusty metal groan beneath my feet, as if the train itself was protesting against my intrusion. Reaching the end of the carriage, I found a door leading to the engineer's cabin. I hesitated for a moment, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. When I finally turned it, the door opened with a sharp creak that seemed to cut through the air. What I saw inside the cabin left me breathless. Everything was intact, as if the engineer had just stepped out for a break. The control panel, covered by a thin layer of ice, was still faintly blinking. How was this possible after so many decades? My eyes were drawn to a small leather book on the engineer's seat. It was a diary. With trembling hands, I opened it. The last pages were filled with frantic, almost illegible writing. I managed to decipher a few phrases. The storm is not natural. Something is following us. Time is bending. The last entry ended abruptly in the middle of a sentence. God help us. They're calm. At that moment, I heard a noise behind me, as if someone had entered the carriage. I turned quickly, my heart almost jumping out of my mouth. What I saw when I turned made my blood freeze in my veins. In the corridor of the carriage, a nebulous and translucent figure hovered a few meters from me. It was the engineer, or at least what was left of him. His eyes, empty and lifeless, fixed on mine, and I felt as if I was being pulled into an endless abyss. He didn't speak, but somehow I could hear his voice in my head, a desperate whisper, "Run before it's too late. Time is closing in on us." In the blink of an eye, the figure disappeared, and with it, the entire scene around me began to dissolve. The carriage, the cabin, everything began to be swallowed by the blizzard that now seemed to come from inside the train itself. I panicked and ran towards the exit, stumbling and crawling through the snow that was invading the interior. When I finally managed to get out, I found myself back in the clearing where I had first seen the ghost train. The blizzard had completely stopped, and the sun was beginning to break through the clouds. I looked back, expecting to see the remains of the train, but there was nothing but untouched snow. The only trace of my experience was the old pocket watch in my pocket, still stopped at the same time. To this day, years later, I can't explain what happened on that mountain. The watch remains stopped, a constant reminder that there are mysteries in this world that defy all logic and reason.